let's also focus on the larger economic impact. The escalating Russia-Ukraine war has raised global concerns, with commodity markets inching up at a record pace. Supply fears loom large. The global oil prices have surged to $139 a barrel. This is close to the all-time high of $147 a barrel that was recorded back in 2008. Now, the spike comes as U.S. has signaled about a possible ban on the import of Russian oil and natural gas. But let's talk specifically about the situation in India. At this point in time, remember, India imports about 85% of oil requirements, and the rising prices directly impacts India in several ways. But at this point in time, fuel prices are stable. Now, this is something that is a little unusual because global oil prices have now surged. Petrol, diesel prices are deregulated in India. Fuel prices, however, should be changing on a daily basis, but that's not happening, largely because OMCs try to keep prices stable during volatility and, of course, the ongoing assembly elections in the country. So once these elections are over, we are likely to see prices spike going ahead. And to discuss all of this, and specifically this aspect as far as the Indian economy is concerned, I'm being joined at this point on the broadcast by Madhavan Narayanan, economist and senior journalist, as well as Yuvika Singhal, who's an economist as well. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us. Yuvika, if I can start with you first, with respect to the kind of impact we're going to see at this point in time on, the petrol and diesel prices come next week.
Hi, Avni. Yes, so there is a lot of uncertainty, moving parts. As you rightly pointed out, we haven't seen petrol and diesel are de facto deregulated. We haven't seen them inch even higher, slightly higher over the last month. And this is despite crude oil price, as you mentioned, almost an all-time high. So we are expecting that prices will be revised up once, we have gone through the state elections, which are probably, probably next week on, we will probably see prices inching up. Now, what kind of impact that it could have on inflation actually depends on how much of pass-through happens, one. So how much of this burden is passed on to the consumers, how much of it is actually absorbed by oil companies, and where the crude prices, somewhere settle down after the knee-jerks and a completely monotone upward increase that we are seeing right now. So our own assessment for the 10% increase in crude oil basket, that is the India crude oil basket, it adds about still over 20 basis points to our CPI projection. So if we for the entire year see, it's a hypothetical, again, too many moving parts, but if crude oil basket was to an average of, say, $95 a barrel, which is also a conservative estimate looking at where we are, we could see inflation for the entire FY23 close to about 6%. Another scenario, if prices were to average close to about $115 a barrel next year, we could look at inflation close to about 8%. Now, these are base case scenarios, and we do not assume any fiscal, response here. But if the government was to cut excise duties, a rupee 5 reduction in petrol and diesel could assuage inflation to the extent about 10 to 15 basis points. But again, we have to think that a fiscal jugglery at the end of the day, because any cut that happens comes with a loss to the exchequer. The P5 cut petrol and diesel could cost the central government just about 65,000 crores. So, like I said, it's jugglery. So one way you have to assuage inflation pressures, which are largely stemming from global commodity and especially crude oil rallying the way we have, but some kind of fiscal let go on the tax revenues would also at the level, and perhaps something the state governments also lower VAT on crude oil prices. So it has to be a combination.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, Mr. Narayanan, if I can get you in on this as well, obviously this is because of the elections that we haven't seen even a single rupee that has gone up as far as petrol and diesel prices are concerned. Your own perspective on how much that impact is going to be passed down once this is over and, in the next couple of days is what we can expect. Because remember, last time round, it took a lot, before the government actually stepped in to cut taxes. And this time around, there is much more uncertainty as well.
Yeah, I think I just saw Yuvika make a fairly decent quantitative case for what could be. I think we are looking at, something like a 1 percentage point cut in the GDP growth rate and a comparable rise in inflation, perhaps. But that's overall. As far as oil is concerned, I want to mention two things. One is a very interesting factoid, which is that when Mr. Modi came to power in May 2014, the next month, June 30 is when the oil price started falling. And it was when Modi came to power, the oil price was at the same level roughly as it is this week. So it's like a end of a very long honeymoon that Mr. Modi has enjoyed, with the pandemic, of course, taking it to a $30 low. Now, coming to the point of whether petrol prices or diesel prices would be raised, my own guess is that they will be staggered. But the important point to remember is that GST now covers oil prices and oil goods, and therefore this is a good opportunity for the government and the GST Council to consider a tax cut, because that's the only way. On the one hand, the government will gain more revenue if the prices stay this way. On the other hand, it will be throttling economic growth and pushing up inflation, which has a knock-on effect on both the rupee also, because some predictions say the rupee could go from 76 rupees to a dollar to 77 as a result of this. And then there are interest rate implications for RBI. Now, all this means that it could be a vicious circle if the government doesn't play its cards right. So my own guess is that the RBI and the government will work in tandem to stagger the whole thing. Knowing the RBI governor, I would expect him to deliberately delay any interest rate cut, even if inflation is kissing 6% and the consumer price inflation, because he's a Dow and a growth-friendly person. And right now, the government is stuck between a hard and a rock and a hard place, because you don't want to throttle growth and you don't want inflation. But the good news is that the end of UP elections and all of this round of elections means inflation is not going to become political for a few months, by which time things might stabilize. So they might like to hold back some of the oil price hike and, in fact, do some cushioning and some accounting jugglery to buy some time and hope for the best. But this is not a headache that can be avoided. It can only be postponed. So I'll stick my neck out and say the GST part will be coming into discussion sooner than later. And you can expect possibly a tax cut accompanying a possible rise, and the rise will not be as much as the market prices would warrant, because the market prices are themselves volatile right now because of the war-like situation. It's not. It was already a factored in surge in oil prices as a result of global economic recovery. But the recovery is right now being turned on its head, as it were, by this whole Ukraine thing. Therefore, the government may well use the confusion to buy time and symbolically raise the oil prices a bit and cut the GST a bit and hope for the best. But, a lot depends not on Mr. Modi, but on measures Putin and Zelensky.
Yes.
Honestly, this is not something that anyone would want to guess on, even attempt a guess on from the government. So my guess is that they would talk it down, and if the situation warrants, walk it up a little.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And I think that uncertainty is sort of what is adding, obviously, to the volatility, because nobody can predict at this point in time how things are going to play out from here. But Yuvika, on that point that Mr. Narayanan was talking about with regard to what the RBI can or perhaps should do at this point in time, with the inflationary levels, the pressure at this point in time, already reaching close to that 6% mark, we'll have to see how all of this passes on as we go forward. But can the RBI afford to not hike interest rates given the kind of pressures on inflation that we are seeing right now?
So, Abdi, I think it's as challenging for the Reserve Bank as it is for the government. And we have always maintained that, despite growth needing a hand holding, it is also perhaps time that RBI needs to lay the path for normalization of monetary policy. It could happen over a period of time. I'm not saying that we have to rush into it, but somewhere RBI needs to start making a provisioning for it. And largely, if we had to take a leaf from what is happening globally, we have seen global central banks literally fall behind the curve. They talked about inflation being transient for the longest time to only be woken up a bit too late, and now they are rushing to raise rates. We're talking about six rate hikes. In this year was probably unimaginable a couple of months ago. So I think somewhere it is important that we do realize that that growth needs a hand holding, but at the same time, the economy is now inching towards pre-pandemic levels. We are almost at par. In fact, we have breached the pre-pandemic levels in several sectors. While yes, consumption does need a bit of hand holding, some of the sectors do need a bit of hand holding. But having said so, we need to lay the path down for monetary policy normalization to happen in a gradual, smooth manner in FY23. The first line of act should be of restoring the LAF corridor through a hike in the reverse repo. We think it will happen over the months of April and June, and then probably the second half of the year, once we have clarity over how the macros are behaving, whether the current geopolitics is settling down, whether, how are the monsoons performing. Perhaps going into the second half of the year, we'll have better answers, and probably that will nudge RBI to consider hiking repo rates, because we can't live in a world where we are completely out of sync with what is happening globally. So somewhere that pressure, yes, from global markets, as well as what is happening on the domestic front, from inflation, from growth, will keep RBI extremely alert and vigilant, and that will probably see some action happening in the second half of the year as far as the repo rate is concerned.
Absolutely. In fact, Mr. Narayanan, the other big aspect, of course, while we are talking on a more macro level, when it comes right down to it, to the common man, to what people have been going through since the pandemic broke out, and obviously the financial implications, the burdens, loss of jobs, people have been facing so many things, and right now, more is simply in store. And the issue of demand, which has been one of the biggest pain points, consumption, which was slowly sort of picking up. Do you think that could be hit once again with all of this uncertainty at this point?
I'm glad you asked that question, Avni, because before that, let me just mildly, in an amused way, mention that Yuvika made a lovely straight copybook case, but we are in a warlike situation, and nobody really cares about whether India's central bank plays by the rules right now, because everybody's house is on fire. Please understand that even Visa and MasterCard and Swift banking are in a mess. So this is not the time to really anyone worry about a quarter point hike or a 25 basis point hike in interest rate or something like that. So if India does sin on that count, nobody will bother. Even rating agencies may be barking in a corner, nobody will give. So from a pragmatic point of view, that brings me to your question. The fact is that the LIC IPO is likely not to go through this month. So there is this whole demand thing and the fiscal deficit thing hanging in the fire. And the government may not be in a hurry to spend too much, but it's not going to let go of this capital expenditure thing, because without demand, we might see a problem a year or two from now. So my guess is that there will be some noises made about inflation, but nothing will be done. And the government may as well, most likely will wait for inflation to cross a statistically visible level, a percentage point above 6% or something, before trying to actually cool it down. Economists will say that, this is like a genie out of the bottle, but the government will be very worried about middle class and lower middle class votes, because BJP has historically worried more about inflation than joblessness, if you look at the political economy of BJP's origins. And therefore, my bet would be on the fact that the government may err on the side of, managing inflation, even if it means the rating agencies saying something that may not be very good for investors. But, we are in an extraordinary warlike situation where there's even talk of a third world war. So this is not the time to practice orthodoxy either on fiscal deficit or on interest rates. So, but yes, there is a gaping hole, and it's anybody's guess where it will go. But I would rather use political rather than economic criteria to assess this. The government is not will buy itself a year's time because of the UP elections being over, but will probably stagger everything up and take 1 month at a time.
Yes, absolutely. Yuvika, just taking that point forward in terms of how prepared are we as an economy to handle this kind of a shock where there is no, there's no certainty, there is no clarity at all of what's going to happen going forward. And do you think, when do you think that point will come where we start then fearing that we are going to lose the progress that we've made in trying to bring the economy back on track, and how much back could we possibly go on that front?
Avni, honestly speaking, crude oil is one exogenous variable that tends to upset our macros in a far-reaching way. So if you look at, I've already spoken about CPI projections. I was talking about an 8% with crude remaining above 110. We could look at a current account deficit widening above 3.5%, probably close to 4%. If we talk about GDP, every 10 percentage points increase in crude oil basket shaves off about 20 basis points from our GDP growth. So it does create, in some sense, kind of a havoc as far as our macros are concerned, a single parameter as far as as far as global oil prices is concerned. And as authorities, both the government and RBI, we can't turn a blind eye to what is happening on our macro front. And when all this happens together, when we see inflation shooting up, when we see our current account deficit widening, literally you'll have depreciation pressures on the rupee, and you'll probably see calls for outlandish calls for rupee also being taken in the market. So somewhere to add some semblance of sanity, as authorities, you need to step up and take certain decisions or make certain decisions that probably comfort the markets. Like I said, there are too many moving parts at this point in time, and it's very difficult to gauge where the economy will be headed. In any case, we were living, in extraordinary times over the last 2 years. We had the, COVID as a backdrop, and going into a war-like situation, this means 3 years of exceptional policy, whether it's fiscal policy or government policy. But somewhere we do need to rationalize that when is the time that we actually move away from setting policies in an extraordinary environment. It could be baby steps, it could be gradual, but we need to be cognizant of the fact that we can't let fiscal policy be extremely expansionary through and through, and monetary policy looking through inflation. So somewhere we need to sit up and take notice of macro stability and financial stability from a slightly longer perspective, not just a 6 months or a 12 months horizon. And I think that is what is important. Again, a war-like situation doesn't help the macros. It doesn't help projecting the economy or projecting macros in the economy easily. But I think, as and when we see the situation evolving, we'll have a better handle, a better grip on what is happening in the economy, and the policies can be accordingly tuned to what we are facing.
All right, absolutely. Extraordinary situation after extraordinary situation. It seems we'll just have to wait and see what happens, at least with respect to the fuel prices when we wake up tomorrow morning. But on that note, thank you so much, both of you, for joining us and giving us that perspective.